All right. All right. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. Thrilled to be here. I am Dr. Jeff Moore, currently serving as the CEO of ICE, lead faculty for cervical and lumbar spine divisions. Thrilled to be here on a Leadership Thursday, which, as always, is a Gut Check Thursday. So let's get right into it. What does Gut Check look like this week? It looks spicy. It always looks spicy. Gut Check is going to be 3 rounds for time. We've got 15 devil's press, and that's going to be with 40-pound or 25-pound dumbbells. So devil's press, of course, you're going to have the dumbbell as you go down into what is almost that negative push-up, right? Chest all the way to the deck. You're going to press up out of that, and then you're basically going to do a double dumbbell snatch to get the weights overhead, right? So down into that push-up position, back up, and then bringing those weights up overhead, back down. That's 1 rep. You're going to knock out 15 of those. Then you're going to run 400 meters. You're going to repeat this 3 rounds for time. It should be great. Please tag us in there. Always love watching the videos. Hashtag Ice Train. Tag Ice Physio on Instagram. Can't wait to see y'all out there. Course-wise, what's coming up next weekend, January 22, 23, we've got our lumbar spine course is going to be in Greenville, South Carolina at Onward. And then we've got also Older Adult Live over in Paoli, Pennsylvania. So some good stuff coming up for you next weekend. All right, team, I want to do a series of videos on presenting tips. There's probably very few things that I enjoy doing more professionally than trying to engage an audience on a topic to make it meaningful, to make it fun to listen to, and to allow them to go away a little bit better. So I've got a whole host of ideas, but the one I want to start with today is leveraging the Q&A. I think of all the things that when I watch other people present, an area that I think would immediately level up most people. And team, it doesn't matter why you're presenting, right? It doesn't matter if you're doing a community lecture on back pain and you've got a bunch of people in your audience who are just members of the community who think you might be able to help them out with their back pain, or if you're doing a seminar for a local healthcare group, or if you're doing a weekend seminar like we do at ICE. It doesn't matter. The audience and the venue is going to be irrelevant for all of these presenting pro tips, certainly for leveraging the Q&A. This is universal stuff. It doesn't matter what the setting is. So let me break this down in 2 parts. First, let's do the how. Like, how do you get questions? Because if you can't get the questions, the rest of the stuff is meaningless. So let's talk about how do you get people to ask questions first. Then let's talk about why it is so critical to leveling up your presenting skills in the overall value that people perceive when they spend time in your audience. So how do you get people to ask questions? All right. First things first, there's 3 key principles that underline all of it. Number 1, you have to have a depth of knowledge in your content area that removes any insecurity about questions that might come up, right? If you've got a ton of gaps, we've so many topics on PT on Ice Daily Show have talked about the power of your nonverbals, the power of your bias, right? Even when you're not saying things out loud, even knowledge that you have, how that gets communicated with the patient, right? Or the colleague. That is so true here. People can perceive when you really don't want questions, like you're trying to any questions? Okay, let's move on. Like when you're insecure about what somebody might ask because you haven't really mastered the material, that right there is going to break your ability to really get really good engagement. And it kind of follows the second principle, which is you have to not only not be insecure about questions that might come at you, you have to want them. You have to have a sincere interest in getting other people's opinions. You've got to have curiosity. If your audience feels that you are sincerely curious about their beliefs on the subject or their questions or how they're approaching the issue, you are going to get questions galore. So if you can authentically get yourself to a point where you're saying things like, team, I would love some questions. I'm so curious where you all are coming from on this. Right? Anybody coming from a different angle than I presented. And if you can say that in a way that says, my gloves are down. Right. I have a good understanding of the way that I came at this topic, but I am authentically, legitimately, and insatiably curious about where you're coming from. If they can feel that, You will get questions all day long. Number three, you got to have time allocated. People can feel when you're rushed. Have you ever been talking to someone who's in a hurry? You don't ask them questions. They're going around the living room trying to get out of the house. You don't ask questions, but you can tell they're in a hurry. The same thing is true when you're in the audience and the presenter's obviously rushing through the material. There's no way if you're sitting there like, oh man, I really need some clarification on that for this to be valuable for me. There's no way you're bringing that up because you can tell the person's racing to the finish line. You have to have time allocated because that's what gives you that calm presence and that's what backs up the sincere curiosity. So when you say, team, I'd love to hear where you're coming from, not only can they tell you actually mean that, not only can they tell that you're not positioning yourself to be defensive in any way, shape, or form, you also actually have the time to take in their point of view and have some back and forth to make it meaningful. Those three things above all else have to be in line first. You have to master your material so you're not insecure about what somebody might ask. You have to go further and have a sincere interest in actually hearing their opinions. And you have to have time allocated. So not only do you not seem rushed, you seem excited to pause and really dive deeper with your audience on the content you just presented. Those three things need to be in line. Okay, a few other tips to get questions. You never say, do you have any questions? You always say, okay, what questions do you all have? Because that drastically changes the expectation and the intention of the audience. Do you have any questions implies it's fine if you don't. What questions do you all have implies you should have some questions. We always have questions. Now we're doing the question part, right? You really couldn't not have questions. I just presented so much new material. So what questions do we have? Let's go ahead and engage those. So when somebody hears what questions do you have, their reflex is I should have questions, and they come up with questions, or they feel very, very comfortable asking questions they do indeed have. So no more do you have any questions. If you're going to say that, just skip it. Right. If you're going to say, do you have any questions? I would say you're not really in a spot where you're expecting, desiring, etc. And that's fine. Right. Maybe just get through the next part and then say, okay, now that we've done this, team, let's pause for a second. What questions do you have? Let's dive into those. No, do you have questions? Yes, what questions do you have? Okay, another tip. Your first response is everything. So the way you answer the first question is going to set the tone for whether or not people are in a safe space to be vulnerable, because everybody feels like their question's dumb, right? Everybody feels like, oh, maybe I missed it, right? Or maybe somebody else already asked it, or maybe I should know this. That generally is what's prohibiting people from asking. Your response, I don't care what that first question is, right? The hard thing's getting the first question. Your response is always, excellent question. Thank you for asking that. Like, you know what? That brings up a really good point. Oh, shoot, I should have covered that. Great point. Let me unpack that a little. Team, those are your responses, right? Oh, that question is perfect. Like, thank you so much for bringing that up. In particular, on the very first question, whoever's willing to put that hand up, those praises of excellent question. Thank you so much for asking. Oh, that brings up another great point. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. Those kind of things. All of a sudden, everybody else in that audience is almost now eager to ask because that person was so celebrated. And that person, not only did they not feel dumb, they felt like they added to the substance because they did. And we'll get more into that here in a second. But make sure on that first question, you leverage the opportunity to secure a safe space. And that will really stimulate questions moving forward from there. Okay, finally, before we get into the why it's so important, if you aren't getting them, and we've all been there, right? And I would argue it's because some of the other things weren't in line. And you probably said, do you have any questions? But you aren't getting them. You're standing there and nobody's putting their hand up. What do? Okay, here's some emergency strategies for when that's happening and you're really seeing like you cannot get any good questions. First of all, say out loud that you have time allocated. So maybe you're a bit nervous about other things in the presentation, so it seems like you're rushed, but you're actually not. But people are perceiving that you are just because you're nervous. Just say out loud, so team, I've got 10 minutes carved out right now, planned for us to have some Q&A. So I would love your questions so we can have a little bit of back and forth. Just literally tell people I have time. It might not seem like it. I've got a lot going on up here, but I do. And this part has been planned, and we're not going to miss material if we engage. So we've got time. I'd love to hear your questions. If that doesn't work, number two, go ahead and ask about the area of content that you just presented that's most likely to conjure up questions. In other words, narrow the field. So instead of just saying any questions on anything that I presented, say, team, what are your thoughts on that one part about frailty I just talked about? Right? Go ahead, and that usually, if you get that specific, the person or two people who had questions on that, you've now basically you've almost singled them out, even though you haven't done it with name. They're like, oh, that's exactly what I had a question about. He wants to talk more about that. I'm going to go ahead and put my hand up. So when in doubt, narrow the content. Ask for opinions. This one's a little dicey, right? Because we always laugh about the person who's not actually asking a question. They're doing a mini presentation. So you got to be a little careful. But if no one's giving you questions, just say any thoughts or opinions, anything a bit different than what I presented. Go ahead and ask for opinions. That does often get people rolling. When all else fails, even when those emergency strategies fail, just do this. Just say, team, I'm going to let it get a little awkward here because your questions make this stuff so much more interesting and relevant. I'm going to pause until I get one. Most groups will not be able to tolerate more than 7 to 15 seconds. Like when you're standing there and it's like, all right, we're going to do this. We're just going to stand here until someone throws their hand up. Someone in that group is like, all right, I got this, right? And then once that person does that and you say, excellent question. Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. Now here we go, right? And once the floodgates open, the floodgates open. And you'll have questions because you created that space, you created the time, you have the curiosity. All of those things now manifest. It's just a matter of getting that first hand up. That is how you get questions. All of those principles, I'm sure you'll have to go back and listen to that. There's quite a bit of meat there, but that's how you get the ball rolling. Why is it so important? And I'm here to say it's everything. The Q&A is everything. Here's why. When you build a presentation, I don't care if it's for your colleagues or for your community or for other providers, it doesn't matter who you're talking to. You're guessing on what they want and need. You're guessing. You're sitting at your computer, you're putting together a slide deck or whatever, and I think that's going to be valuable. I think this would have some merits. You're guessing. Questions are telling you what they want and need. I always say that only audience questions guarantee a presentation's relevance. Only audience questions can guarantee a presentation's relevance. They are literally telling you, hey, thanks for the effort. Here is exactly what I want to know. And what you're there for is to bring value and relevance to the audience. Questions guarantee that, like nothing else can. Obviously, that's powerful for value on that given presentation, but that's also what guides your product for future reps. Because now you're getting insight into, oh, this is what people want to hear about. So now when you go back and you reformulate that presentation, you've got this great data of like, oh, I thought they were going to want to hear this, but everybody asked about this. So like, not only do you get more immediate value, but the quality in relevance of your presentation escalates because those questions came at you. Okay, number two, this is big. This is really big if you're talking to patients or you're talking to community members or someone who you want, providers who you want to treat in a different way, where you're challenging these people to make a change. This one's huge. Questions are what removes barriers to commitment. So, team, let's face it, when you're standing in front of a group of 20 or 30 or 40 or whatever, and you're preaching there's a better way to do something, most of those people are sitting there and they're saying, yeah, that makes sense. And that but is something about their individual ecosystem that they perceive as a barrier that means they can't implement what you're saying. Team, where could I begin on the options here? I don't have that equipment. Oh, that's a great idea, but I don't have that equipment. I don't have a squat rack in my clinic. I don't have this. I don't have that. I don't have the time, right? The way that I schedule patients, the way that my life looks. I have degenerative disc disease. There's no way I could do those yoga poses, this, that. That looks good for other people, but it wouldn't work for me, right? This is what most people are thinking. You don't know which people are thinking what though until they tell you. So when they say, Oh, that looks great, Dr. Moore, right? But I can't do that to self-treat my back because I've got degenerative disc disease. So I'm sure you understand, right? That's not in the cards for me. And now here's this beautiful moment where they've shown me the one thing that was going to keep them from actually taking my presentation and making it actionable. And I can begin to gently have this conversation about how maybe imaging findings don't need to drive their behavior quite so strictly. But it wasn't until then. If they wouldn't have asked that, they would have walked away from my presentation and done nothing. Instead, they showed me their barrier, and now I can target it. And now all the actual content of my lecture can be relevant and usable for them because we eliminated their barrier. Their questions reveal their barriers, and that's what allows your content to actually be actionable on an n=1 level. And remember, 10, 12 people probably had the same barrier. So not only did you eliminate it for that person, you eliminated it for everybody in the audience who had it. Okay, number 3, this is where you learn. The Q&A is where you learn. By far, the most impactful moments of my teaching career have been where someone got me. Like they asked a really good question. I was like, oh, I have not thought about that, right? Oftentimes, when you presented the same material a lot, you kind of fake that you haven't thought about it, right? And you're like, oh, let me think, it's a great question, right? But in reality, you've heard the question quite a few times, and you're just not making them feel as though they asked an easy question. You're saying, oh, it's a great question. You pause a bit, then you say, here's kind of my thoughts on it. Sometimes, though, people get you. And they come at you from an angle you haven't thought about. And what a valuable moment for you as a presenter. Because first of all, it's a little bit uncomfortable, and uncomfortable things stick, right? Like you're like, ooh, you got me. I don't know. Let me think on it. First of all, actually think on it and get back to that person. But number 2, you're never going to let that happen again, are you? Right? That question's never going to get you again because it burns you a little bit. And now you go home and you're like, man, I did not think about that. And you go into that research and it kind of reshapes all of your content a little bit because it was so relevant. You hadn't thought about it. This is how your presentations become best in class. This is the process of creating that diamond. That's the pressure. Those questions, they expose your little gaps, and that's okay. Don't get defensive up there. You're going to bat 97%, right? Don't get upset about the 3%. Realize, ooh, this person just made my product better. That's how you respond internally. Not, oh, someone got me. It's fine, right? In fact, looking at them and saying, I haven't thought about that. What a great thought. What are your thoughts on it? I better get thinking about it. What a cool moment that is for the class of humility, engagement, and depth. Okay, last one, I swear. This might not be relevant for everybody, but it certainly is for us going around and teaching. This really helps you, question Q&A really helps you understand who's engaged. It's really hard to ask the class, like, hey, Nikki, are you into this? Are you into this at all? Like, are you digging this? You can't do that on an every person basis. Having space, people that ask really well thought out, intentional, valuable questions, those are the 5 or 6 people in front of you that are really into your content. You're probably going to have a really long-term educational relationship with. Maybe they even wind up being a part of your tribe down the road. Like those show you who really cares about this material. And being able to identify those people is really important as we're all trying to move forward and build teams and create things that really create substantive change at scale. So knowing who is who couldn't be more important. Okay. How do you get the questions? Those key principles. Don't be insecure. Be really curious. Make sure you have time. It is never, do you have any questions? It is always, what questions do you have? Your first response is everything. Create a safe space. Excellent question, Dan. Oh, that brings up another great point. Thank you for asking that. Create the safe space. If you aren't getting them, tell people you have time, make it about specific content, ask for opinions. And when all else fails, make it awkward. It is valuable enough to deal with the awkwardness, make it awkward. What are the benefits? Audience's questions guarantee a presentation's relevance. You're guessing what they want, they're telling you. Leverage that second one. It removes barriers. Love the idea, but wouldn't work for me because you can't eliminate someone's barriers if you don't know what they are. Team, this is where you learn. It exposes your gaps, and that's a beautiful thing as we're trying to create perfect products, and it identifies who is really engaged. There is nothing more valuable than the Q&A. There is nothing in presentations that's more valuable than the Q&A. Learn to leverage it. Hope you enjoyed that. I've got a ton of these. I'm not sure how many I'll do, but hopefully that had some value. Team, have a wonderful Thursday. We'll see you next week.